There is a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name. It's not grief. Grief has an object, something you can point to and say, "That is what I lost. This is different." This is the feeling of looking at your own life and not recognizing the person living it, the job you built, the identity you maintained, the version of yourself you presented to the world every single day. And then one morning, without warning, or with all the warning you chose not to see, it isn't there anymore. What's left isn't sadness. Sadness would be easier. What's left is blankness, a hollow where a self used to be. And the moment that happens, everyone around you says the same thing. Get back up, rebuild, move forward, go back to who you were before this happened. And that advice, delivered with love from people who mean well, is the most dangerous thing you can do. Carl Jung spent his entire career inside this question, not as theory, as lived experience, and what he found should permanently change how you understand what you are going through right now. The moment something collapses, every instinct you have organizes around a single goal: restoration. Get back to functioning. Rebuild what fell. Return to the person you were before the break, before the loss, before the diagnosis, before the relationship ended, or the career dissolved, or the identity you had maintained for years simply stopped holding together. And underneath that urgency is an assumption so embedded you have probably never examined it. That who you were before the collapse is who you should return to. That recovery means reconstruction. That the goal is to put back together exactly what came apart, as fast as possible, before anyone notices the gap. Jung would call that the first and most costly mistake a person can make. Not because rebuilding is wrong, but because returning to the same foundation without understanding why it cracked is not rebuilding. It is preparation for an identical collapse with higher stakes later, when you have even less left to lose. Jung knew this from the inside. After his break with Freud in 1913, he didn't just lose a colleague. He lost the most powerful external validator in his professional life. The psychoanalytic establishment turned its back. The institutional framework that had given his work legitimacy dissolved. What remained was Jung alone, with his ideas and no one to confirm they were worth anything. By every external measure, he was failing. By his own account, he was descending. But Jung did something most people cannot bring themselves to do. He did not try to stop the descent. He followed it. He sat with it, drew it, documented it for years, without knowing where it was leading or whether he would return intact. And what emerged on the other side was not a restored version of the man who had broken with Freud. It was something entirely new, a psychology, a framework for human transformation that would define the rest of his life and influence every serious thinker who came after him. The collapse was not the interruption of his path. The collapse was the path. Here is what no one tells you about falling apart. Most of the time, what breaks is not you. It is the version of you that you built for other people to see. Jung called it the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre, the face you constructed to navigate the world, the competent professional, the devoted partner, the person who has it together, the version of yourself that earned approval or respect or simply the absence of rejection. Every person builds one. That is not pathology. That is survival. The problem comes when the adaptation becomes the identity, when you stop wearing the mask and start believing you are the mask. Think about what preceded your collapse. How much of your daily life was organized around maintaining an image, around being the person others needed you to be, around sustaining a version of yourself that the world had come to expect. And beneath that performance, if you are honest, what was actually there? Maybe not much. Maybe a person who had stopped asking what they actually wanted because the question felt selfish or dangerous, or simply irrelevant to the life they had already committed to building around other people's expectations. Jung watched this pattern destroy patient after patient. A man who had defined himself entirely through professional achievement would lose the career and find that underneath it, there was nothing. Not a wounded person, nothing, no preferences, no desires, no sense of what he actually valued apart from the role he had been performing. Because the persona had been doing all the living, and the actual self had been quietly starving in the background for years. This is the specific cruelty of collapse. It doesn't feel like losing a role. It feels like dying. And in a very real psychological sense, something is dying. Just not what you think. What dies is the structure you mistook for yourself. The grief is real, but what you are mourning is not yourself. You are mourning the mask and the terrible comfort of knowing exactly who you were supposed to be. Your collapse didn't begin on the day everything fell apart. It began months earlier, maybe years. There were signals, small ones first. A persistent dissatisfaction with no clear cause. A faint but growing sense that something was wrong beneath the surface of a life that looked functional. An exhaustion that sleep didn't fix because it wasn't physical. It was the exhaustion of performing a self that no longer fit. You managed the signals, reframed them, told yourself this was just the cost of the life you had chosen, until the system ran out of room to compensate and everything came down at once. Jung didn't believe in psychological accidents. He believed the psyche was purposeful, not in a mystical sense, in a structural one. Symptoms don't appear randomly. Depression doesn't arrive without cause. Burnout doesn't happen to people who are living in full alignment with who they actually are. These are communications, the unconscious speaking in the only language left to it after everything else was ignored. The question worth asking, and most people never ask it, is not, why did this happen to me? That question keeps you passive, positioned as the victim of your own life rather than the person responsible for understanding it. The real question is, what was I refusing to see? Because collapse almost always arrives at the exact point where the gap between the life you were living and the life that was true to you became too wide to hold. Sometimes that gap was built from external pressure, a career chosen to satisfy someone else's ambition, a relationship maintained past its honest end because leaving felt too costly, a persona constructed so early and so completely that you genuinely forgot there was a person underneath it. Sometimes it was internal suppression, decades of swallowed anger, needs you never acknowledged, desires you buried deep enough that you stopped feeling them altogether and then convinced yourself the absence of desire was maturity. Jung called the accumulated weight of everything suppressed the shadow, everything the conscious self has refused to integrate. the qualities deemed unacceptable by your family, your culture, your own internal censor. The anger that made you difficult, the ambition that seemed arrogant, the vulnerability that felt like weakness, the needs that felt like burden, none of it disappeared. It went underground, where it continued to shape your behavior, your choices, your relationships, invisibly, which made it far more powerful than if you had simply acknowledged it. When the pressure becomes great enough, the shadow doesn't ask permission. It erupts. Depression is frequently not emptiness. It is rage with nowhere to go. Burnout is frequently not exhaustion. It is a self that has been performing a life it cannot sustain. The end of a relationship frequently reveals not failure, but needs that were never spoken because speaking them felt too dangerous. The collapse didn't betray you. It was the most honest thing your psyche had done in years. Every instinct you have right now is telling you to move forward, get back to functioning, rebuild momentum, find a new direction. Pursue it with enough velocity that you don't have to feel what's underneath. This instinct feels like resilience. It is not resilience. It is the same avoidance mechanism that produced the collapse, now operating under a different name. After the break with Freud, Jung could have done what most people do: redirected his energy outward, found new professional alliances, rebuilt his reputation through productivity. Instead, he did something that looked from the outside like falling apart. He withdrew. He played with stones on the lakeshore like a child. He sat with his visions instead of dismissing them. He descended deliberately into the interior, not knowing what he would find, not knowing if he would come back intact. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious. It lasted years. What Jung understood, and what most people are never told clearly enough, is that transformation is not a surface process. You cannot think your way to a new self. You cannot optimize or schedule or discipline yourself into becoming someone fundamentally different. The psyche doesn't work that way. Change at the level that collapse demands requires going down before you go forward. It requires sitting in the ruins long enough to actually understand what they are made of. This is the descent. And it is not dramatic in the way people imagine. It doesn't require a wilderness retreat or the dismantling of your entire life. It requires something harder: the willingness to stop performing recovery and start actually examining what collapsed and why. To ask the questions you have been structuring your entire life around not asking. Who was I really before the roles I inhabited? What did I actually feel in that relationship, that career, that identity when I was honest with myself at 3 in the morning? What did I keep pushing down because there was no acceptable place for it to go? Jung did this through his journals, through what he called active imagination, a practice of engaging consciously with what arose from the unconscious, treating those images not as symptoms to eliminate, but as messengers to understand. He wrote in what became the Red Book for years, not for publication, not for an audience, because the process of externalizing the interior was itself the work. The writing was not about the descent. It was the descent. You don't need to replicate his method, but you need to find your version of it. The journal you actually write in honestly, not the one where you perform insight for an imaginary reader. The therapy where you stop managing how you appear and start saying the things you have never said out loud to anyone. The silence where you stop filling every unstructured hour with stimulation, because the stimulation is a way of staying on the surface and avoiding what lives beneath it. The descent is uncomfortable in a specific way that is different from ordinary pain. Ordinary pain has an object, something that hurt you, a loss you can name. The discomfort of descent is more like vertigo, because what you encounter on the way down is not a wound with clean edges. It is the accumulated weight of everything you have been carrying without acknowledging it, the unlived life, the self you kept postponing, the truth you agreed not to see in exchange for stability that turned out not to be stable at all. Here is where most people make the fatal mistake, and I want to name both traps precisely because you are probably closer to one of them than you realize. When the silence arrives after a collapse, the psyche doesn't stay neutral. It moves, and without conscious intervention, it moves toward one of two positions that feel like coping but function like prisons. The first is victimization, not the acknowledgement that your circumstances are genuinely hard. That may simply be true. Victimization is what happens when that truth calcifies into identity. When this is harder for me, quietly becomes therefore, it is impossible for me. When the injustice of what happened, and it may be genuinely unjust, becomes the explanation for every failure and the justification for every retreat. The bitterness feels like clarity. It has the texture of realism. It feels like finally seeing the world as it actually is, rather than as you wanted it to be. But it is a closed system. Nothing new can enter it because everything that enters gets recruited as further evidence of the original wound. Jung understood bitterness as a particularly insidious defense. It protects you from the vulnerability of trying again and failing in the open. If the system is rigged, then your failures aren't really yours, and neither, quietly, are your possibilities. The bitterness that feels directed outward is always also directed inward, foreclosing something slowly, without announcement. The second trap is its mirror image, and it is just as lethal. Call it the heroic refusal. The decision made somewhere below conscious awareness that needing nothing and no one is not a wound, but a superpower. The person who has been hurt enough times eventually stops reaching, and then begins to construct a philosophy around the not reaching. Independence becomes ideology. Solitude becomes armor. The person who once needed connection and was denied it now insists with complete conviction that they never needed it at all. Jung was precise about what this costs. He describes his own years of isolation not as a triumphant embrace of solitude, but as a confrontation with disintegration, one that required him to maintain real anchors in the world, his family, his clinical work. Small but genuine connections that kept him tethered to human reality while the interior work proceeded. He did not romanticize the alone. He endured it consciously while resisting the temptation to make a virtue of what was simply a necessity. The heroic refusal to need anyone looks like strength. It is, in most cases, a sophisticated avoidance of the grief of having been unsupported, of the risk of reaching again, of the admission that connection is not weakness, but a genuine human requirement. The person who builds this wall doesn't become stronger, they become more defended, and defended is not the same as developed. What both traps share is the same root, an unconscious response to pain that bypasses the actual work. Victimization bypasses it by making the external world fully responsible. Heroic isolation bypasses it by making the self fully sufficient. Both are fictions. Both feel from the inside like they are protecting something real. The path between them is narrow. It requires holding two things simultaneously that the psyche desperately wants to resolve into one: the genuine weight of what happened to you, and the genuine agency you still possess within it. Not one or the other. Both in full tension, without resolution. That tension is not a problem to be solved. It is the condition under which the real work happens. There is a version of what I'm saying that ends with reassurance. Something about how the struggle is building character, how the difficulty is secretly a gift, how one day you'll look back and understand why it had to be this way. That is not what Jung is offering, and it is not what I'm offering. What is actually true is more demanding than comfort. Collapse, when confronted consciously rather than escaped, accelerates the development of something that cannot be built any other way. Jung called it individuation, the process by which the psyche moves toward wholeness, integrating what has been rejected, developing what has been undeveloped, becoming something that could not have been assembled from the outside in. It is not a comfortable process, it is not a linear one, but it produces something that stability, however comfortable, structurally cannot. A self that was forged rather than inherited. Think about what that distinction actually means. Most people build their sense of self on a long history of external confirmation that was eventually internalized so slowly, so seamlessly, it began to feel like their own. A mentor pointed a direction and they trusted it because they trusted the person. When doubt appeared, a voice outside them dissolved it. Over time, they absorbed that voice. The confidence felt self-generated because the original source had become invisible. That is not a flaw. That is how development is supposed to work under favorable conditions. The problem is, it produces a self that has never been tested in isolation. A self that, if you removed every external mirror, might not know what it looks like. You have been forced to find out, not because you are exceptional, not because suffering is inherently purifying. Jung had no patience for that kind of romanticism, but because the external validation wasn't available. The mentor didn't appear, the support didn't materialize. And when the outward path closes, the psyche faces a choice it would never have made voluntarily. Go inward or collapse. Every decision you made without anyone's validation was a repetition of a single proof. That your judgment exists and can function without external endorsement. Every failure you absorbed without a safety net demonstrated something most people spend their whole lives untested on, that you can be broken and continue anyway. Every period of doubt you metabolized alone strengthened a capacity that comfort systematically prevents. The ability to locate your own signal in the absence of external noise. None of this was painless. None of it was fair. But what it has been building in you, unglamorous and unwitnessed, is a self that no one can dismantle from the outside, because no one built it from the outside. The self that collapsed was real. The grief is real. The disorientation is real. The feeling that something essential was taken from you is real. But here is what Jung understood, and what most people are never told directly enough. The collapse did not take your self from you. It revealed that the self you thought you were was never the whole story. It was the part that was visible, the part that had been constructed piece by piece through other people's expectations and your own compliance with them. What remains in the rubble is not nothing. It is everything that was true about you, that the persona was covering. The needs you denied, the desires you buried, the anger that had nowhere to go, the version of yourself you kept postponing because there was no acceptable place for it yet. All of it still there, still waiting, not as damage, as material, as the raw substance of a self that could not be built before because the persona was always in the way. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you performed, not who you were trained to be, not the version that earned approval or avoided rejection, who you actually are when all of that is removed and what remains is examined honestly. That examination is not the end of something. It is the beginning of the only work that ever actually mattered." The work ahead is not easier for knowing this, but it is clearer. And clarity, when you have been building in the dark without a map, is everything. If something in this video named something you has been carrying alone, leave it in the comments. Not what you plan to do, what you recognized. Someone else reading it will feel less alone in what they recognized too. And that is not a small thing. The next video goes deeper into what Jung discovered about the specific way the unconscious communicates what needs to change, and why most people misread every signal it sends. It is more important than you think. Don't stop here.